Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm thrilled to see so many of you here eager to join in meaningful dialogue, meaningful conversation about this system of mass incarceration in the United States. As Dr. King put it quite bluntly, just months before his death, after the civil rights victories had already been won, after the civil rights bills had already been passed, he said, quote, "I do not see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there is an honest confrontation with it and a willing search for the truth and a willingness to admit the truth when we discover it." And so in that vein, I'm going to do my best to tell the truth, the whole truth about race in America today. It is a truth that many Americans will deny, just as they were eager to deny the truth about slavery and Jim Crow in their days. But the truth is this: we as a nation have taken a wrong turn in our stride toward freedom. We've betrayed Dr. King's dream. And perhaps nowhere is it more obvious than right here in the city of Chicago. In this great city, President Barack Obama's hometown, a vast new racial undercaste has emerged, though their plight is rarely mentioned on the evening news. Occasionally, we hear about the homicide rate, the violence that has been spinning out of control, not everywhere, but in certain spaces. At bottom, what makes a community safe is not the number of guns, but the number of good schools, the number of good jobs, the number of educational opportunities, the numbers of opportunities people have for living a decent life. Those are the numbers that matter most when it comes to violence. And in Chicago, as in so many other cities and communities across America, a choice has been made. It is a deliberate choice, and it is a choice that has been made over and over and over again. Rather than good schools, we have been willing to build high-tech prisons. Rather than create jobs and invest in the communities that need it most, we have embarked on an unprecedented race to incarcerate that has left millions of Americans permanently locked up or locked out. William Julius Wilson has written an excellent book about the changes that have occurred in Chicago and other communities around the country entitled "When Work Disappears." And in that book, he cites statistics showing that when you control for joblessness, the racial disparities and violent crime disappear. In other words, if you compare white jobless men with black jobless men, rates of violent crime are roughly the same. Men who are jobless, particularly chronically jobless, are more likely to be violent. Now, joblessness does not excuse violence by any means. Most people who are jobless do not resort to violence. But what we know, and what is no secret, is that communities that are plagued by exceedingly high levels of joblessness are likely to be violent. But a shift occurred here in Chicago and in communities across America, urban communities, beginning in the late 50s, early 60s, into the 1970s, where work disappeared. It used to be that factories would be located in urban areas near segregated black communities so those factories could have quick and easy access to cheap black labor. In fact, as late as 1970, more than 70% of all African Americans working in the Chicago area held blue-collar jobs, factory jobs. Almost overnight, those jobs vanished. By 1987, the industrial employment of black men had plummeted to 28%. due to deindustrialization, globalization, technological advancement, factories closing down, jobs moving overseas, hundreds of thousands of people, overwhelmingly black men, found themselves suddenly jobless, trapped in racially segregated, jobless communities. Trapped. Economic collapse occurred in urban areas across the country. Now, we could have responded to this crisis, to this literal depression occurring in cities like Chicago and Baltimore and Philadelphia and Detroit and beyond. We could have responded to this crisis, this economic collapse, this literal depression, with an outpouring of care, compassion, and concern. We could have responded with bailout packages, economic stimulus programs. We could have provided job training, particularly to young people coming up in these communities, so they could make the rough transition from an industrial economy to a service-based economy. But no, we chose a different road, a road more familiar when it comes to matters of race. We chose the road of division, punitiveness, and despair. We as a society ended the war on poverty and declared the war on drugs. Black men found themselves suddenly disposable, no longer necessary to the functioning of the U.S. economy, precisely at the same moment that a backlash was brewing against the civil rights movement, a backlash that made it convenient for politicians to demonize black men as criminals, as shiftless, as unwilling to work. And so this war on drugs was declared, and black men found that they were no longer needed to work in the fields, no longer needed to labor in factories, and they found themselves scapegoats, pawns in political games, the enemy in a new war, and were rounded up by the millions, locked up, and then permanently locked out. And now, decades later, we stand back and say, what's wrong with these people? Why are they killing each other? Why is there so much violence in these communities that we have abandoned? Communities where good schools cannot be found, but high-tech prisons are a drive away. What's wrong with them? I think the deeper question, the more profound question, is what is wrong with us? Why have we been silent for so long? Well, I've been asked to share with you the thesis of my book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and I think the title of the book pretty much speaks for itself. I argue that today, in the so-called era of colorblindness, and yes, even in the age of Obama, and even right here in Obama's hometown, something akin to a caste system is alive and well in America. The mass incarceration of poor people of color in the United States is tantamount to a new caste system, one that shuttles our children from decrepit, underfunded schools to these brand new high-tech prisons. It is a system that locks poor people, overwhelmingly poor folks of color, into a permanent second-class status, nearly as effectively as earlier systems of racial and social control once did. In my view, this new system is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, I'm always very willing, very happy to admit that there was a time that I didn't think this way, that I rejected this kind of talk out of hand. A time when I viewed advocates and activists who were calling the drug war or mass incarceration the new Jim Crow, I thought they were exaggerating, engaging in hyperbole. In fact, there was a time when I thought that people who made those kinds of claims and those kinds of comparisons were actually doing more harm than good, to efforts to reform our criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But I finally woke up. And I woke up after years of working as a civil rights lawyer and advocate, representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality, and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people who had been released from prison as they faced one closed door after another, one legal barrier to their supposed re-entry after another. Trying to assist people re-enter into a society that had never shown much use for them in the first place. That I had a series of experiences that began what I call my awakening. I began to awaken to the reality that our criminal justice system now functions more like a system of racial and social control than a system of crime prevention and control. As I stated in the introduction, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind.